Come with me to a magical place where being labeled the pork queen is a compliment, where being nice is just a way of life, and where all leaders of the free world must pass through. Welcome to Iowa. Whether you're a current Iowan, an Iowa expat, or an Iowan at heart, this show is for you. This is the Iowa Podcast. Real Iowans, real talk, no drama.
Hello, folks. This is Mark Gannon coming to you from the Iowa Podcast Studio, sponsored by Jethro's Restaurants. Many in Iowa have heard a debate over the proposed carbon pipelines across Iowa and other states. There's been a lot of publicity, meetings, protests, and conversation about this topic. Today we have with us is Jessica Mazour of the Sierra Club, who is leading a large group of Iowans that call themselves No Carbon Pipelines. That's a dead giveaway as to what side they are on. But we'd like to hear a summary of the whole story from the beginning to where we are today, since it evolves almost weekly. I'm going to turn it over to Jessica and introduce herself.
Yeah, thank you, Mark. Thanks for having me and for letting me tell this story because, you know, it's a big deal here in Iowa and there's so many people impacted that it's important that we all know what's going on. Back in 2021, we found out that the Summit Carbon Pipeline was applying in Iowa, and we didn't even know what a carbon pipeline was or what carbon capture and storage was, but we had seen what happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline and that construction and the damage to the land. And we knew the Iowa Utilities Commission process really well, so we decided to kind of take it up and see if we can meet some of the landowners and get their thoughts on it. And pretty quickly we realized that, you know, this project is not at all what it's claimed to be, and it's actually going to be a major problem for Iowans. And when Summit applied, they came in saying, you know, this project is needed because we're going to solve climate change with it. If we build this pipeline, we're going to capture all this CO2 from ethanol plants and we're going to ship it up to North Dakota and we're going to put it underground forever. And voila, we've solved climate change. And, you know, groups like Sierra Club know that that's just a Band-Aid on a problem if we are worried about climate change. And so we started pushing back on that argument, and Summit, you know, it wasn't convenient for them anymore to say this is for climate change. And so then they switched and they said, you know, we need this project because ethanol is going to die without it. And then the farmers across the state, especially those that are impacted by the pipeline, started standing up and saying, you know, this has nothing to do with ethanol. Ethanol is not going to die without this project. And so then that argument became inconvenient for Summit. And so then they switched it for a third time. And this is what they're saying right now is we need this project for sustainable aviation fuel. And we're learning that ethanol is not a good feedstock for sustainable aviation fuel. But what we realize is that when a company keeps changing the reasons that Iowa needs this carbon pipeline, we know none of them are true. And the real reason is there's a lot of federal tax credits called the 45Q and 45Z tax credits that Summit's going to get. And they're going to make a ton of money off of the backs of Iowans. And there's just so many risks and problems and concerns with this project that it's very easy to understand why people don't want it. And so we've been building our group of landowners, and we had about 14 or so at the beginning back in 2021, and we started holding weekly meetings, and it quickly grew to 20 and then to 40 to 100, and now we have probably about 2,000 landowners who are actively participating in our group in the weekly meetings or taking action with their supervisors or the legislature or whatever it is that week that we need to accomplish. And we've been talking with them about what are these big concerns? Why are people so opposed to the project? And we've kind of narrowed it down to 5. Like there's dozens and dozens of reasons people are opposed, but kind of groups into 5 main reasons. And the first one is the land destruction of just seeing what happened with the Dakota Access Pipeline. A construction of that magnitude is not like other pipelines that have gone through our state. It causes massive compaction, drainage issues. The land's not returned to the way it was before, and there's permanent damage. You can still see the scar of the Dakota Access Pipeline from above if you use Google Earth, and that shows us that Iowa's requirement of a 3-year crop loss payment is not nearly enough, and it's going to be a lot more damage than 3 years of crop loss. So that's a big concern for just the people who own these farms, who are going to have to figure out how to farm around the easement, who are going to have to potentially miss a season of planting or harvest based on when construction happens, and then worried about what's their farm going to be like after it's supposedly permanently restored. So that's one big reason. And then the second one is eminent domain, which is just very clearly not meant for a project like this. Eminent domain has a purpose for things like roads and bridges and water lines and, things that we as the public actually can use and benefit from. And there's not going to be a tap on everyone's property to get their daily dose of CO2 from this pipeline, because that's ridiculous. And so it's not a public project. It's not a utility. There's no public convenience and necessity. There's no public use. Any definition of what you need for eminent domain doesn't fit this project. And so that's just a clear reason, because people want to have the ability to do what they want with their land. And these easements say that they can't sell it without Summit's permission. They can't pass it down. They can't encumber it in any way without Summit's permission. They can't plant a tree on the easement, can't build the retirement home that they may have been planning in that area. There's just so many hindrances in these easements that people don't want to sign them, and they don't think that eminent domain should be allowed for this. And Summit has two parts to their project, a phase 1 and a phase 2. And on their phase 1 route alone, there's still over 800 unsigned parcels. So it just kind of gives you the level of opposition across the state. And if Iowa allows this to continue, that's going to be the largest use of eminent domain in Iowa history. And we're setting precedent that any private company can come in and take private land for its own benefit, and that we don't have a say. So that's important for people even that aren't impacted by this pipeline, because, just because it's not your land this time, it could be your land next time with this precedent that's set.
On the 800 unsigned agreements, is that just Iowa, or is that South Dakota, North Dakota, everywhere?
That's Iowa alone.
That's Iowa.
Over 800, and there's hundreds more in all of the other states, because it's not just Iowa that's opposed. It's Iowa, North Dakota, South Dakota, Minnesota, and Nebraska. All of the states that Summit's impacting have groups similar to ours here in Iowa, and we work together quite a bit.
All right.
But then the third reason that people are opposed is just the public money going into this, those tax credits, the 45Q and 45Z. Summit can make upwards of $30 billion or more, and that's just this pipeline, let alone all of the other carbon pipelines that are being proposed across the country. And we don't think that our public tax dollars should be paying for this project. It's more than their upfront infrastructure costs. So we're literally paying for them to build it so that they can profit and take our land in the process. So we have major problems with that, and especially right now with the federal government looking for budget items to cut, because they say we're having major budget problems. We're thinking, well, here's the perfect one. Cut the 45Q and 45Z. That's potentially upwards of $1 trillion in the next decade or so of money that we could save if we just ended this program that's creating all of these problems for people all across the country. So that's a big one, is misuse of our public tax dollars.
Where did that fund come from, or where did what administration? Tell us a little background there. It passed,
and I have to go back to my notes. I think it passed either under Obama or Bush, but then it's been expanded under every president after. So it's got support from both parties, which is kind of a unique thing about this whole carbon capture and storage, is the opposition is bipartisan, and then the support is also bipartisan. So it kind of shows it's kind of a unique issue out there. But it's a program that has had support from Biden. It was expanded under the Inflation Reduction Act. And then right now, what Trump's doing with trying to strip all of those Inflation Reduction Act programs, the only one he is leaving out of that is the 45Q, which signals to us that Trump is also supportive of this tax credit program.
Right.
So last two reasons. The fourth one, this is a big one for people, and it in fact impacts anyone, whether you're on the line or not, and it is safety. This isn't your average pipeline. It is incredibly dangerous. It is an odorless, colorless gas that's heavier than air, and it displaces oxygen. So if you are in the vicinity of where the pipeline ruptures, you're not going to be able to breathe. You're going to slowly get confused and potentially go unconscious, and then at high enough levels of concentrations, you can die. And people might think, well, I'm going to jump in my car and I'm going to drive away and get to safety. But if it displaces oxygen, your car's not going to work. And so your car will not be able to run if it's a gas combustion vehicle. And we saw this happen in Satartia, Mississippi down in 2020. It was a carbon pipeline owned by Denbury and now owned by Exxon. And there was a 7-inch rain, which caused a landslide, and then the pipeline weld failed. And so they had a rupture, and it gassed the town of Satartia. They had over 300 people evacuated, and 40 had to go to the hospital. And the town was a mile away, so it's not even that close to where this thing ruptured. But emergency responders didn't know it was a carbon pipeline rupture. And so they were driving into the plume, and their vehicles were just shutting off, and they didn't know why. And they really shouldn't have been in the plume. They did rescue people that probably would have died because they found them unconscious. And they were people that just happened to be fishing. So they were in the wrong place at the wrong time. And another set of people were in a car driving down a highway, and their car shut off, and they were all unconscious in their car. So this is like incredibly dangerous. And we are worried because the pipeline that they're proposing here in Iowa, the Summit Pipeline, is larger, and it's being built by a company who's never built a pipeline before and really doesn't have interest in anything but these tax credits. We've been working with the federal government, the pipeline agency, which is PHMSA, and we've been trying to get federal safety rules because after that pipeline ruptured down in Satartia, Mississippi, they realized that they need special rules for carbon pipelines. It shouldn't just be grouped in with other pipelines. And so we've been working for about 3 years on federal pipeline rules. And we got as far as the draft rules being released publicly right before the administration change. And then when Trump came in, he put all rules for every agency on hold. And then shortly after that, ours got withdrawn completely. So we're actually moving forward with this in Iowa right now without any sort of safety rules. These pipelines have no separation distance from how close they can be from people's houses.
That's incredible.
Yeah. And there's some people, it's like 200 feet from their bedroom window, and but it's not on their land, it's on their neighbor's land. So they don't have a say in this, but it could kill them if it ruptures by their house.
The easements, which isn't wide enough probably either, but it's 100 feet, or remember what it is? It's
100 feet or 50 feet, kind of depending on the area. But then there's always the permanent easement, and then they have like 50 extra feet of temporary work easement. And so it's a big chunk of land, but it's really close to people's homes. It's close to schools and parks, to city limits, livestock facilities. I mean, you name it. This pipeline is like a ticking time bomb that's going to be all across the state.
And it's forever.
That's right. And then the last reason people are opposed is just the amount of water that this project's going to need. And we don't want to become like Nebraska or Kansas, where we're in water wars and our aquifers are draining faster than we can replenish them. And so what this project's going to need is at every single ethanol plant that Summit plans to hook up to, they're going to need a water withdrawal permit from the DNR for water because the process to capture that CO2, it creates a lot of heat. And so they have to have cooling systems. And so that amount of water is terrifying. It's 3.36 billion gallons of water annually just for Summit's project alone. And then if you add that on to the water the ethanol plants are already using, it's 13.5 billion gallons of water annually. And we have never done a comprehensive study in Iowa of how much water is in our aquifers, how fast are we using it, and how long it's going to last. And so we cannot be handing out these permits like candy because we need that water for the people of Iowa and for our businesses and our daily lives.
So that water would go along with the carbon and down a hole up in North Dakota. Isn't that the plan?
Well, actually, they cannot put the water in the pipeline because if water and liquefied CO2 touch, they create carbonic acid.
Oh.
And so that would corrode the pipe. And then, we don't know what would happen underground if we're pumping water and CO2 underground, or if that CO2 that we pump underground ever leaks into our aquifers, we've acidified our drinking water sources. And that's where they're proposing to pump the CO2 is deep underground underneath aquifers. And we've already seen a leak in Decatur, Illinois. The ADM facility is doing their sequestration on site. It's one of the first facilities in the country to be doing it. And we've already found out it's leaking. It's not leaking up into the air, but it's leaking beyond where it's supposed to stay underground. And it's underneath the Mahomet Aquifer in Illinois, which is a major drinking water source for lots of people in Illinois.
Yeah, I thought the same thing when they were doing the fracking up in North Dakota. They put a lot of carcinogens in the ground, and everybody said that was going to be safe. But how does anybody know that's going to be safe? I mean, it's incredible what was happening. And are they talking about using the same wells that they use for the fracking?
So that's another good question because we don't actually know. We have an idea. Summit for a long time has been saying that their project's just for permanent sequestration. And so that means they would use their own pore space and just pump the CO2 underground and it would stay there forever. But we think what their actual plan is since they're going up to North Dakota near the Bakken oil fields, that they're going to put the CO2 into depleted oil fields to get that last little bit of oil up a bit easier. And they can get paid through this 45Q tax credit, whether they do permanent sequestration or enhanced oil recovery. And one of the big investors in Summit is Continental Resources, which is a huge connection with the oil industry up in North Dakota. So we think that's the real intent, and we're just hoping that it's going to stay down there. But yeah, we assume it's going to be pumped down into those depleted oil fields down in North Dakota or up in North Dakota.
Right.
So we have those concerns and many, many more. And that's created this really unique coalition of people who are opposed because, I'm Sierra Club and we're working with like Republican farmers.
So who are the investors? I know it's Summit, but what became of Navigator, and there was somebody else too, wasn't there?
Yeah. So back when Summit applied, shortly after, two other carbon pipelines applied, Navigator and Wolf. And in the last 4 years, we've stopped those. That's why we know we can stop Summit too, because it's just so clearly wrong that people aren't signing easements. They're fighting back, failing to get support, and those projects crumbled. And I think Summit's just a bigger beast because we have, the co-founder of Summit is Bruce Rastetter, who is a well-known figure here in Iowa and has had many controversies in the state, but he also has a lot of connections and he's a major donor. And so I think that just creates a little bit bigger of a beast to stop, but it's not going to stop us from fighting back because there's just so much at stake if this project's allowed to proceed.
So now the Wolf and Navigator investors are just out. It's over.
Yep.
Is there a bankruptcy or anything, or they just closed it?
They just canceled it. Now, Wolf, I have a feeling at some point in the future might try to come back. But Navigator ended up selling their easements and some of those contracts they had with the ethanol plants to Summit. So that's why we have a Summit Phase 2 line is after Navigator canceled, Summit expanded and connected to those Navigator ethanol plants.
So anybody that sold to Navigator now is part of Summit.
Exactly. And that's one of the big concerns we have with these easements is it can be assigned or sold to anyone. You have to ask permission if you want to sell your land, but that company can sell it to whoever or a group, a business, multiple people, and you don't have a say in that.
Yeah. Well, it's a lot like the wind power. Mid-Americans, they're probably not going to sell them, but we've done a couple that with somebody out of Texas, and it changes 3 times by the time it actually gets operating. So you don't really know who's behind these eventually.
Yeah.
But, I had a couple people. I manage farms, and of course, I have my own opinion, but, when we were approached by Summit and Navigator, most people didn't want to do it. But I had a few people that said, how much money is it? And they're older, and they knew that it would never affect them anyway. So we had a couple of them, take the money. We had to negotiate with them and actually got a lot more than what they ever first offered, which is always kind of the battle. Well, we always pay everybody the same. You hear that stuff all the time. It turns out
that's
not the case. And that's what's interesting. Well, to get on a different subject, but in Iowa, there's no disclosure on easements and prices. And so that's not public information. So, I feel bad for the people that gave in early and took their money and found out the neighbor got 3 times as much, and to me, that's wrong too. But some people just look at the dollars and they don't know this issue with what you're talking about. And that's part of what we're doing today is try to alert people that it's a bigger picture than just you getting $30,000 or whatever it might be.
Absolutely. And so many people have said after they've learned more, they kind of wish they hadn't signed. Because I think Summit went out very early before we really knew what this project was all about, before we'd built our big opposition group and really pressured people hard. Like we heard they were going to nursing homes with donuts trying to bribe people, that they were targeting vulnerable people like elderly or widowers first. And they were using lots of things like, well, all your neighbors have signed, so you better sign too, or this is the highest offer you're going to get. It's only going to go down from here. And I think that kind of high pressure, at the beginning when no one knew that there were people opposed to this, it worked. But I think if we were to be able to see a graph of, how many easements were signed each month throughout this whole 4 years, it would be a giant downward curve. It would be a lot at the beginning, and then as people learned, it's just no one signing. And it's kind of, eye-opening right now with the phase 2 route, because they are now just starting to try to gather easements on phase 2. So there's land agents all across the state pressuring Iowans to sign easements. And Summit has to file these things called an Exhibit H list, which is a list of the landowners that they think aren't going to sign, the ones that they're going to use eminent domain on. And when on phase 1, when they filed those lists, they had it's a map, and you could see the red parcels are the ones that hadn't signed an easement. The green parcels had signed an easement, and the white ones you didn't know. And so you got a really good picture of every county. Every time they filed one of those maps, we could tell who had signed, who hadn't signed, and who was still on the fence. And now when they're filing these for phase 2, they've left green off. So either they don't have any easements and they don't want us to know about it, which is kind of what I'm thinking is, they don't want to brag about 1 or 2 easements in an entire county. But I also think when you look at these maps now, all you see is red and white. You see either people that are not signing or you see these white. And there's no description for what the white is. So we've heard that these land agents are going out and saying, hey, look, these are the only people in the county who haven't signed, and all these other ones have, when that's not accurate. So they're willing to say and do anything to get people to sign.
I remember meeting with some of the first ones that came around, and even though they didn't have the right to use eminent domain, they certainly was in their conversation, and I questioned that. I said, you don't, because he said it's going to be cheaper when eminent domain comes in.
Yep. And they're not supposed to talk about eminent domain in those negotiation conversations.
Anyway, that's an interesting story. But I mean, I got 2 navigator easements on farms I manage at one Summit, and I don't know if it'll ever happen or not. I don't know. But again, these were people that, first of all, needed the money. Mm-hmm. I mean, maybe they're just living off their farm. Maybe it's a lady that's, owns 80 or 160 and not getting a whole lot of rent, maybe living on Social Security or, and so to get a lump sum like that was a big deal.
Yeah.
And they didn't understand it. And all of them knew that I wasn't in favor of it. But again, it was their property, and I couldn't tell them not to do it.
Yeah, I think they put a lot of people in tough situations.
Yeah. So I've heard people say that instead of doing this CO2 pipeline, that they could handle this CO2 issue on the ethanol plants. Do you know much about that?
I've heard a couple different things of on-site sequestration, where they would capture it and then pump it underground just right on site, right below us. Iowa's really not quite the same as some of the other states where we don't have just ample pore space, is what they call it, underground. Plus, I don't want our aquifers to turn into carbonic acid if there's any sort of problem. I think it's too risky to be pumping the CO2 underground. If we are so concerned about CO2 emissions, which I'm in that camp, concerned about them, we need to think about how we're reducing them, not just putting Band-Aids on it. And then I've also heard that there's this idea of making green methanol with the CO2, capturing it, and then having these plants to make green methanol. And that's also concerning because that will require even more water than what Summit's carbon capture project would require. And when they get to scale, it's also going to require pipelines and eminent domain.
Yeah.
For how do you get that methane somewhere?
Yeah. And
I think that's just one of the things we're learning is there's all this talk about methane and hydrogen and carbon dioxide. And, it kind of seems like we're creating this big commodity race to capture these, what we're considering and sometimes pollutants, and making money off of it. Mm-hmm. And we're not thinking about the risks that go along with that, how dangerous it is, the precedent that it sets, and the safety. It's a big thing that I think we need to grapple with as a state of, if we're going to tackle climate change, if that is the goal, as Summit says, let's do it in a way that's not so harmful, not so intrusive on people's lives and land.
Yeah. Well, you could bet these people wouldn't be that worried about climate change if there wasn't a dollar sign behind it.
Right.
You
yeah.
know, so
never seen Bruce do any sort of climate initiatives until this one.
Well, it's
one thing you asked earlier though that I forgot to answer was there's investors. And so for Summit, there's a lot of investors that we don't know because they have individuals, but we know John Deere is a big investor. That Continental Resources is a huge investor. That's that oil company up in North Dakota. And then there is an investor from South Korea, and it's SKENS. And that one's interesting because they've actually already been charged, I think, twice with defrauding the Department of Defense. And so it's like, why are we working with this company that's already been in trouble for defrauding the government? And now we want to, give them access to eminent domain to take people's land. And there's like TPG Climate Rise, and there's a couple others, but it's a lot of secretive things going on of who's actually going to benefit from this.
Right. Well, and the eminent domain thing is probably my biggest issue because land is what I do, and I just don't like people, having the ability to do whatever they want. Just like you said, I mean, it doesn't. Since this is forever. You put a pipeline through a piece of property. Now you can't build a house there. You can't. There's a lot of things you can't do now. But you're getting paid up front based on trying to pay it on land values today. Mm-hmm. But it affects you forever. And the argument is that you get to farm it, and that there's no issue there. That you still get to farm it, so it's no big deal. I mean, there's a lot of pipelines through a lot of farms, but not to this scale, I don't think. And I'm with you on the. When the Bakken pipeline came through, you can still see those places. Mm-hmm. And I knew a guy over in Boone County that his agreement was, and maybe everybody's agreement was this, that if he could prove that he was getting a yield reduction, he could get paid as long as he could prove it. And he was doing it. I mean, he was like 6-7 years. Keith? Yeah, he took time to do it, and but actually he's passed away now. But he said he
was it
he
Vern
documented.
Johnson?
Huh?
Vern Johnson?
No.
Not Vern Johnson. Okay.
No, it was a Cooper over there. But so it was interesting because at that time, some people asked me to maybe do a little study on if there's any evidence or any data out there, and there really wasn't, because I contacted Iowa State and then, well, how long does it take to bring this back, and what's the best practice to bring it back? Maybe it's put manure on it, maybe, I don't know what it would be, some sort of organic matter. Then really, there wasn't any that I could find any real good data. The 3 years I knew was wrong, unless you really did it right and it was dry, and if it was muddy or something, that was a problem. That made it even worse. But, so the other states, South Dakota's having a problem. Mm-hmm. North Dakota, I don't know where. Can you give us an update maybe on some of those?
Yeah. So North Dakota is obviously a really pipeline-friendly state. So their Public Service Commission approved Summit's permit, but the landowners up there are appealing it. So we're just kind of playing it out in the courts right now. And the same with the sequestration site in North Dakota. They're appealing that approval as well. And then in Iowa, for ours, we have the Phase 1 route, which was approved because our Iowa Utilities Commission is appointed by the governor, and she handpicked 2 people halfway through the process that were put in there to approve it. But we're also appealing it. We have a group of landowners, a couple hundred landowners who've all teamed up and hired their own attorney. We have a group of over 40 legislators who have filed an appeal. Counties have teamed up and hired an attorney, and then the Sierra Club is appealing. And then Phase 2, they're just starting here. But the big one is South Dakota. That's where they're having just a lot of success because the landowners there, just like Iowa, don't want it. And they had a really big incident happen early on where Summit forced a survey, drilled like 90 feet down into this guy's land, destroyed some crops, and filed a restraining order on him so he couldn't even get onto his own property during this whole process. And it really backfired, and it created a firestorm of people who were adamant on stopping the project at the Public Utilities Commission level and banning it at the legislative level. And just in the past month, they've done both. First, the landowners during the last election replaced 14 of their pro-pipeline legislators with anti-pipeline legislators. They took over the leadership in the Senate and the House and passed a bill to ban eminent domain for carbon pipelines. So Summit cannot use eminent domain in South Dakota. And then just last week, or maybe it was 2 weeks ago, the Public Utilities Commission there denied Summit's application for a second time. And so now Summit has to figure out how to get from Iowa to North Dakota, but they can't use eminent domain in South Dakota and Minnesota. And so that's, how do you get through there? And that's why we want that bill in Iowa. We want to have a ban on eminent domain for carbon pipelines, because why should Minnesotans and South Dakotans have more rights than us?
Right. Now, you might tell people about your website. I noticed today, looking through it a little bit, you had a list of legislators that are pro. It'd be interesting for people to look at and see where their people are. But anyway, I want you to tell. And you got what is it? Your meeting today, or is that yet last night?
We had a meeting last night. We have our weekly landowner meeting every Wednesday at 6. But we have our website where most of the pipeline information is housed is nocarbonpipeline.com, not with an S, just nocarbonpipeline.com. And then we have some information on the Sierra Club website, which is sierraclub.org/Iowa. And then for any landowner out there who's interested in joining the legal team, because there's hundreds of landowners in Iowa, South Dakota, North Dakota, and Nebraska who've all hired the same attorney. If anyone's interested in that, it's iaeasement.org, the Iowa Easement Team. And it's a growing group of landowners who are, fighting this tooth and nail to make sure that the Iowa Utilities Commission does not approve the second phase.
Was that the lawsuit, or was that the attorney firm out of Omaha?
Yes. Yep. It's Brian Jordy with Domina Law Group, and they're out of Omaha, but they're representing landowners in all the impacted states.
Right. Okay. Well, let us know what we can do. It'd be interesting to hear the other side of the story. I don't know if they're willing to jump in here or not, but we're open for that. So, but I do appreciate your effort. I've been watching it for years now, and I don't know how they could have got anybody better to do what you're doing. So
thank you.
All right.
Yeah, and anyone who wants to get involved, call the Senate right now. That's our big push. Is we have a bill that bans eminent domain for carbon pipelines out of the Iowa House. It's in the Senate now, and all we need for them to do is bring it up for a debate. We only need 26 votes to pass a bill in the Senate. We have 28 and counting. But our problem is Senate leadership and the governor are saying they're afraid that the bill is going to pass, so they just don't want to bring it up. So anyone that can contact the Senate and the governor's office, that's how we're going to kind of push us over the edge and make sure that we can protect property rights in Iowa.
Yeah. Well, we have kind of the same issues with water quality and some other things with agriculture that we need to address here in the next legislative session, or next election. So we're going to be talking about that here too. So
yeah.
Anyway, I appreciate it, Jess, coming on today, and
thank you.
And you did a nice job, and we appreciate your effort and all the other landowners that are joining in.
Yeah, thank you very much. We'll hopefully talk soon.
Yep, thank you.
And to my fellow Iowans, Iowa expats, and Iowans at heart, thanks for listening and subscribing to the Iowa Podcast.